Well, hope you have found the session over lunch discussion engaging. But we're going to get started now with our session 2, farm viability in the face of social and economic needs. So our session will feature 3 paper presentations. So first, Dr. Annalena Bruce, Director of the University of New Hampshire Food Systems Lab and Assistant Professor in Food Systems in the Department of Agriculture, Nutrition, and Food Systems, will present "A Farm is Viable If It Can Keep Its Head Above Water: Farm Viability, Persistence, and the Sustainability of Agriculture in New England." Dr. Allison Bauman, research scientist at the Department of Agricultural and Research Economics at Colorado State University, will present the impact of expanded healthcare coverage on U.S. beginning farmers and ranchers. Dr. Florence Biko, a rural sociologist and associate research scientist at the National Farm Medicine Center, will present farm families' challenges meeting their social and economic needs and the consequences on the farm business, the example of childcare. And the discussion at the end of the session will be moderated by Dr. Jessica Crow, Chief of the Rural Economy Branch in the Resource and Rural Economy Division in the USDA Economic Research Service. So I will hand it now over to our first speaker.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks for being here, everyone. I've really enjoyed the conference so far. So thanks to the organizers for making this happen. There's my title again. So I'll start by just introducing really briefly. My research program is focused on programs, policies, initiatives, and also technology like high tunnels that support small and mid-sized farms, in particular with their efforts to balance regenerative farming practices with farmers' need to earn a living. Next. So there's widespread public interest in local food systems that are designed to create closer connections between farmers and consumers. And we know that these relationship-based market networks were in some cases a lot more adaptive and flexible than conventional commodity supply chains during the pandemic. And so they have an important role to play in increasing the resilience of our food system in the face of future disruptions from weather extremes linked to climate change and other disruptions. Next. So for an example of the significant initiatives and efforts, investment in this kind of local and regional food system development is this planning partnership that's happening here in New England. However, all of these initiatives are really dependent on farmers' ability to increase food production to supply local and regional markets. And we currently really have no evidence-based understanding of what would make that possible. So the findings that I'm presenting today are really part of a larger study that's focused on understanding what are the barriers and opportunities for farmers to increase food production and their farm income for local and regional markets here in New England, and farmers' livelihood strategies and what factors shape them. So this project is part of a larger network of researchers called Agriculture of the Middle, funded by USA NIFA's Hatch Multi-State Program. So these are 2 of our core objectives that our research project is contributing to. So understanding the key factors that influence the economic performance and viability of small-scale farms and their supply chain partners. We are also focused on small-scale farms because it's New England. And so there's been significant structural challenges and changes that have really eroded farmers' ability to earn a livelihood from agriculture. And so farmers are increasingly reliant on off-farm income because the median farm income, the median farm income has been negative, given that the actual revenue generated from farming is negative or marginal in many parts of the US, in particular for small and mid-sized farms, as you see from this chart from a USDA ERS report published in 2018. Where you can see how it's really only for commercial scale farms that gross more than 350K, where they're able to, they're reporting a positive income from their farms and able to rely on the income they generate from their farms to make a living. And so this farmers' increased reliance on non-farm revenue really complicates standard conceptions and ways of understanding and thinking about farm viability. We see this increased tension between the way that farm viability is defined and conceptualized and the way that farmers are actually making a living as their livelihood strategies have evolved and changed. So as you can see here, also from USDA ERS, just this past month, even though small and mid-sized farms make up a relatively small or smaller percentage of US food production, in terms of number, they're still really significant in terms of the amount of farmland that they control, and also for many other reasons. So the economic importance at the community level, the connection to land and place, the cultural identity that these farms have in rural life, as well as playing a really important role in the resilience of the food system, as I mentioned. So in this same USDA report, the authors address this reality that slightly more than half of US farm households reported a negative income from their farming operations each year. And so what their analysis is doing is showing that if we account for the underreporting of farm income, which is significant and important, as well as the asset appreciation of farmland and tax offsets on their off-farm income, this increases the share of farms with a positive return from their farm operations from about 43 to about 70%. However, and so they argue that accounting for the asset appreciation and tax loss benefits can help explain why it could still make financial sense to continue farming despite these negative or marginal returns. And that makes sense from the standpoint of US farm owners and their financial decision-making and security. But what I want to call our attention to today is the important implications of this reality that farmers' financial incentive to stay in agriculture because of the appreciation of their land and their capital and equipment assets is really in many ways in direct conflict with the need to preserve and protect US farmland and to ensure equitable access to land for the next generation of farmers in this country, and for those who have been denied access or lost their access to farmland because of the history of discrimination in the US. I also want to call our attention to the premise or the assumption, which is widely held, that US farm owners' financial and household financial security is really the primary metric of importance for economic assessments of agriculture. So the big question that I'd love us to think about today is, can we have farm viability without food production? There's this disjuncture between standard measures of farm income, farm economic performance, and the way that small and mid-sized farms especially are actually earning a living. And that raises questions about the most suitable ways of assessing the economic performance and condition of agriculture. So in our work, we argue that these significant structural changes in agriculture might require us to reevaluate the research approaches, methods, and tools that are typically used to evaluate the economic performance of agriculture. Standard measures or metrics that have a narrow focus on things like gross or net farm income and productivity don't tell us about the economic realities of farmers' lived experience or the factors that shape their decision-making, how they meet their social and economic needs, and also the impact, the economic and otherwise social impact of small and mid-sized farms on their local communities, or the sustainability of agriculture at the local or regional level. The narrow focus on farm household economic returns also doesn't pay sufficient attention, I think, to the significant shift in how farmers are earning a living and how they're meeting their economic needs. So that emphasis on farm owners' household income and financial interests, regardless of the income that they're generating through their agricultural production, ignores the social and the policy implications of this shift in agriculture to non-agricultural revenue streams in the US. So there's multiple approaches to assessing the economic performance of agriculture. Agricultural economists tend to focus on gross and net farm income, as I mentioned, and farm household income, productivity measures. And generally, farm viability is defined as meeting the income needs of the farm family. So covering sufficient farm operating costs, meeting household consumption needs, replacing capital equipment, and servicing loans. Whereas in comparison, rural sociologists and anthropologists have focused more on farm persistence. This has a longer term orientation, focusing on how farmers are persisting, adapting, and surviving, particularly in the face of the impacts of industrialization of agriculture and how that's impacted farm households and rural communities. And there's a lot greater focus on these interrelationships between the farm enterprise and the farm operators and their household level dynamics. So we see this disconnect between farm viability and farm persistence, where farms commonly persist over time and produce food for people despite not meeting the definition of economic viability. And we know that economically viable farms often close, as we heard in the previous session, for a host of non-economic reasons. So farmers' decision to stay in agriculture is rarely based on economic viability or the enterprise alone. Lifestyle goals, their motivations to contribute to sustainability in the food system, and really importantly, to carry on the family legacy are some of the really important drivers. So as you can see from this interview quote from a key informant in our study, that farming is more, it's in people's blood, it's something they love to do, it's more like art. So there's been some calls to expand definitions of farm viability that encompasses agricultural viability, so at a regional rather than a household level. And part of this is about shifting from an individual to a more food systems or community scale. And it's also about paying more attention. So there's been calls specifically to learn more about how farmers understand and define farm viability for themselves, and paying greater attention to sustainability of agriculture as a system that's also inclusive of people doing the work of farming. So not just farm owners, but also everybody involved in the work of farming. So in our study, we're taking a sustainable livelihoods approach, which is an analytical tool that's been adapted by researchers from diverse fields and contexts. It comes from the economic development literature, more focused on the global South, but we think it provides a framework to really gaining a food systems level understanding of the interactions between farm household level dynamics and relationships with the broader context in which people develop their livelihoods. So we have a New England focus, and I'll keep moving. So this is our adaptation of the Sustainable Livelihood Framework. You can see the factors most of interest to us in terms of how farmers' livelihood strategies are shaped by the broader food context and system in which they are embedded, as well as farm level factors like household level dynamics, farmers' own identity and access to resources, the role of institutions and organizations that shape farmers' livelihood strategies to help us understand these outcomes that we're interested in terms of farm income and food production, as well as farm persistence, the preservation and equitable access to farmland, and resilience of the food system in New England. So we interviewed 37 farmers that represented a wide range of agricultural production systems and farm types across all 6 states of New England, as well as leaders of grassroots and community-based organizations and agricultural service providers. And you can see we conducted these interviews during the pandemic, so everything was done by Zoom, and used some rigorous team-based analysis and coding to understand our data. Next. So just briefly on the agricultural context here in New England, the declining farm income and increasing concentration of farmland in New England is really pronounced. You can see that we've had this increase in very small farms, what I would call micro farms that gross less than 10K. and a shift to larger farms taking up a greater share of farm production in the region. And then a decline in both small and mid-sized farms, more commercial scale small and mid-sized farms, where, for example, in the state of New Hampshire, where I am, we see this decline in both the number of farms and acres of farmland, where only 6% of farms in the state are generating more than 100K in sales. So our data reflect a range of farm size and scale, as well as product mix. They also reflect a range in terms of, you can go to the next slide, in terms of farming experience and the approaches that farmers are taking, the marketing channels they're using, and also farmers' personal identity in terms of their gender identity, sexuality, and race. Keep going. So what I'm going to do now is share some of New England farmers' reflections on farm viability in their own words. So the farmers that we interviewed overwhelmingly defined farm viability as the ability to keep the farm in business from one year to the next. And so they talked about keeping the farm going, staying in business, keeping the farm's head above water, and surviving. So in contrast to that standard definition of generating sufficient income, it was more about survival. Continue. Farmers also talked about viability in terms of the preservation of the farm to the next generation. So really aligned with the focus on farm persistence and rural sociology, they really emphasize being able to pass down the farm to the next generation and their family. When farmers did talk about generating an income from their farm operation, it was in aspirational or future-oriented terms. So, for example, this farmer says, I don't think anyone should have to work for free. You should be able to make a salary and support yourself. And I don't think it's a bad thing for farmers to want to make some money doing this, although it's incredibly difficult to do. Another farmer, it has a similar sentiment. They talk about how farm viability to them means it has to meet the financial needs of me and anybody I employ. That's one of my goals. You can continue. I want to be able to pay myself well and better than I'm paying myself now. I want to be able to have an employee who's working at least most of the year and getting their main income off the farm. Farmers also talked about farm viability in terms of the ecological dimensions as being intimately interconnected and interrelated. So, for example, this farmer talked about how part of farm viability is generating enough revenue to keep the business going, but also that the condition in which you leave your farm. So in terms of your farming practices, and not depleting the soil to the point where it's not going to produce high quality food for the next generation. And so that being a really central part of viability to them. Farmers also brought in an element about climate resilience. So farm viability, especially looking forward, is about building resilience into our growing systems to better withstand the kinds of extreme weather events that we're seeing in this region. And that the viability of farms is really going to require a shift in growing methods in order to become more resilient. Then farmers also talked about farm viability in terms of their own health and well-being. So, for example, many farmers talked about the mental and emotional and physical impacts of working excessive hours in order to stay in business. And so feeling like their business is really not in a place where they're able to afford to pay the people that they need in order to ensure a viable farm business, and the burnout and emotional toll that takes on their health and well-being. So naturally, when we asked farmers about what viability means to them, they also spoke about the challenges that they experience. So just a couple examples of this. This farmer talks about how many of their colleagues in agriculture are just on the cusp of being able to make it or not make it at all. And that being this very small difference, even between 5 and 20K. And so the type of investments that are needed to make it possible to do this work of farming, just not being there. And they emphasize that there's just never enough money to invest back into the farm in terms of their capital assets, their equipment, their machinery, in order to create a viable business, because they're not generating sufficient revenue from their operations. Next. Another common sentiment that I know will be discussed in the next presentation was about health insurance. So being able to meet their health and social needs, for example, with health insurance, you know this. That's why so many people have jobs off the farm, because that's the only way to have health insurance. It's insane how health insurance makes farming impossible for so many people. Next. So some closing thoughts in a farmer's words. There's a lot of buzz around small scale farms and local foods and sustainability, but it's not translating into dollars into people's pockets. There's so many other things that matter in terms of pollinators, the environment, community, beauty. All of these things are also a part of what we do. But if it's just not financially viable, it's not going to work. And they talk about how farmers aren't able to charge what it costs to produce the food that they're growing because of the market context that they're operating in, and the competition. And so talking about the need for more subsidies or grants or some kind of external support in order to help small and mid-sized farms. Otherwise, they just won't be there. And then closing thoughts from one of the organization leaders. If you have a farm that's worth 250K in farming, that's worth 2.5 million as real estate, there's this temptation to sell. If farmers can't earn a living on the land, they're going to be driven out of farming. Whether they love it, they're crazy, they were born to do it, because they simply can't afford to stay. And so they talk about the land values that just continue to rise, and beyond anything that you could ever earn in farming, and that we have to do something at the policy or systems level to change that dynamic if we want to continue to have farming or agriculture in this region. People say they want local food, but if you can't afford the land to grow local food, we're not going to have local food. So to wrap up here, is New England agriculture sustainable? So this isn't a surprise that New England farmers really can't persist or stay in agriculture through production alone. So from an individual household financial level, relying on increased agricultural production is really financially risky and costly. So it really makes more sense from an individual standpoint to rely on these alternative revenue strategies. And so the current institutional context and system is really discouraging or disincentivizing farmers from growing food. And so from a regional food system perspective, the current system is really threatening the long-term sustainability of agriculture in New England. So I want to just recognize my amazing team. Elise Neidecker and Cindy Zhang conducted the analysis of this, what I presented today. Isaac Leslie really shaped the design of the study and conducted the interviews. And Alexa Wilhelm did the data analysis as well. And I'd like to thank all the farmers and movement leaders that we interviewed and for sharing the images that you enjoyed today. So thank you.
Thank you, Annalena.
Okay.
And I think to stay on time, we can go to our next presentation, which is Ali Bauman.
Thank you. So my name is Ali Bauman, and I'm going to be talking today about the impact of expanded health coverage on U.S. beginning farmers and ranchers. I wanted to thank the USDA Economic Research Service for supporting this work, and to note that the findings and conclusions are of the authors only and do not represent any policy. Our research team is myself and Becca Jablonski. We're both at the Department of Ag and Resource Economics at Colorado State University. Allie Hills at UC Berkeley and Tim Beatty at UC Davis. So as Shoshana opened the conference with, US farmers and ranchers are aging. So the average age of operators continues to increase. It's up to 57.5 as of 2017. There's 4 times as many farmers that are over 65 as there are that are under 35. So given this dynamic and the aging farmer population, new and beginning farmers are seen to play a really important role in the future of US ag. And as a result, there's been quite a lot of attention paid towards how we could increase the viability of this group of farmers. And I know we've talked a lot today about the Farm Bill and its importance in shaping the agricultural sector. And in the most recent, the 2018 Farm Bill, there's numerous programs to support beginning farmers and ranchers. So this includes increasing access to training, education, markets, capital, and land. But one challenge that's not addressed is affordable health care. But as we've discussed a lot today, there's a lot of farmers spend time working off farm. Shoshana in a recent paper reported that over half of farm families have at least one adult working off farm, primarily so they can get health insurance. In some recent work that we have that's under review, we found that for operations where the principal operator works majority on farm, they have higher survival rates. So one way we could help beginning farmers to be successful is to help them spend more time on the farm. If you look at the graph on the right, can you go back? The graph on the right, you'll see this shows the percent of principal operators working majority off farm. So all beginning is an operation where all operators have 10 years or less farming experience. You can see 73% of all beginning operations have a principal operator working majority off farm. So these issues are particularly important for beginning farmers. The middle bar is any beginning. So this would be a multi-generational operation where some operators are beginning, but not all. 56% have principal operators working off farm and 51% of established. So as we've talked about a lot today, working off farm is a really common practice in US agriculture. But one way to support farmers to be successful, and particularly beginning farmers, is to help them spend more time working on farm. Next slide. So one way that this could happen is through the Affordable Care Act. So the Affordable Care Act, ACA Medicaid expansion, is a law that went into effect that I'm sure we all know about, where since starting in 2014, states had the option to extend Medicaid coverage. So they had basically a larger pool. So those with incomes of up to 138% of the federal poverty line would be eligible for Medicaid. So in the map, the states that are the reddish orange color, those are all the states that did implement Medicaid expansion during this time period. And the blue are those that did not implement Medicaid expansion. Which this brings us to our research question was, did the Affordable Care Act, ACA Medicaid expansion, enable beginning farmers to reduce off-farm employment and to focus their efforts on farm work? Next slide. So there's been quite a lot of research on the effects of ACA Medicaid expansion. So previous research found that ACA Medicaid expansion led to an increase in health insurance coverage. And specifically for farm workers, it led to an increase in health insurance coverage, but it had little to no effect on employment, hours of work, or wages. So the effects, the point of ACA Medicaid expansion is to enable more people to have health insurance. And that's really what it did. But it didn't have some of these other effects on employment that were thought or predicted might happen. But we're not aware of any research specifically on ACA Medicaid expansion and beginning farmers and ranchers. So when we're thinking about how to define beginning farmers, there's two ways that we define them. So first is all beginning. So this is where all operators have 10 years or less experience farming. And basically, the reason this is important is because, so as I showed you for some of the Farm Bill programs, depending on the program, the definition of beginning farmers differs. So these definitions can help guide policy. So for example, the NRCS program for beginning farmers, all operators must be beginning in order to qualify for that program. The second definition is any beginning. So this is your multi-generational farm. So you have some operators that are beginning, but not all of them. And this is probably where the majority of the beginning farmer programs fall into this category, in the sense that for example, for FSA loans or for crop insurance, for these programs, it's just one operator applying. So it doesn't matter how many operators on the farm are beginning, it's just the single operator beginning. The single operator that's applying must be a beginning farmer. Let's go back just one. In our previous research, we have found that all beginning operations tend to act in one way, whereas these any beginning and established operations look a lot more similar in terms of, in many of their outcomes. Next slide. So we use data from the Census of Agriculture from 2012 and 2017. We use the restricted access farm level data. So this enables us to track individual farm operations over time. So we talked quite a lot, Mary talked a lot about ARMS. So the Census of Agriculture collects data on the farm business, and it does not collect any data on the farm household. ARMS is a data set that is also very useful, that collects data on both the farm household and the farm business. And the reason that we're using Census of Agriculture is it's really the only data set that allows us to track farmers over time. ARMS is more for cross-sectional analyses. Although you can do some over time, it's much more difficult. But if anybody has ideas on how to cleverly incorporate ARMS data into this analysis, please send me a private message. I'd really enjoy that feedback. So the Census of Agriculture, we have all farms over time. We want to limit our sample of operations to just those that survived. So we're really just interested in change in off-farm work for operations that survived, which means they filled out the survey in 2012 and in 2017. We want to focus on commercial operations. We have a very liberal definition. There's a lot of farms in the census that report zero sales, and we allow farms to have zero sales in 2012 because they could be a beginning operation and have made purchases of livestock or fruit trees and they don't yet have sales. But if they continue to have less than $1,000 in sales in 2017, they're dropped. And then because health insurance decisions are really made at the household level, we limit our sample to only those with either one operator or those in which all operators are in the same household. We have two different dependent variables, both related to off-farm work. So the first is, where did the operator spend the majority of their time? And this is asked for all operators, majority on-farm, majority off-farm. And then the second is a categorical, how many days did each operator work off-farm? None, 1 to 49, 50 to 99, etc. So some key questions that are not asked that would be ideal to have would be, one, a question about whether they have health insurance. And then the second is household income. Both of these are available in ARMS, but they're not available in the census data. So we focus on off-farm work rather than health insurance because that's the data that we do have available. And then just second, since we don't have household income, this is the sample of all producers. Some of the producers in the sample are eligible for Medicaid expansion because they fall below the limit, the 138% of the federal poverty level, and then some do not, but all are included in our sample. Next slide. So what we do to model the impact of ACA Medicaid expansion on off-farm work is we use a model called a difference in difference. It's really commonly used in economic research. In all the previous studies that I discussed, all of them used a difference in difference approach to analyze the impacts of ACA Medicaid expansion. So one challenge with economic research is it's really hard to find causal impacts because we have too many things moving at the same time. So when something happens like ACA Medicaid expansion, it provides a very cool natural experiment. So it essentially gives us a treatment and a control group. So the treatment group is the states that implemented ACA Medicaid expansion, and the control groups are those that didn't. So we can take the difference in off-farm work between these two, the treatment and the control group, and then we also take the difference over time, so the difference before ACA and the difference after ACA. And what the difference in difference model does is it calculates the difference between these two differences. And this allows us to make causal inference on the causal impacts of ACA Medicaid expansion on off-farm work. And this is really why we've focused on the Census of Agriculture, because it allows us to do this very powerful model because of the richness of the data that's available through the Census of Ag, since we have all observations over time. Next slide. So we have, we have a few different ways we are going to think about off-farm work. So the first way we can think about the way households make decisions on health insurance is based on one member of the household. So essentially, it's that the household makes a decision based on one person going off and getting health insurance for both or for all members of the household. So we create two different variables. One is basically a max in household. So one, if anybody in the household works majority off farm and zero otherwise, and then a maximum in household working at least 100 days. So we assume 100 days is about the cutoff for half-time, about 20 hours a week off the farm, which is a cutoff for a lot of employers to offer health insurance. So basically, if anybody on the farm works at least 100 days off farm, it's a 1, if not 0. So I'll show you the results for this set of dependent variables. Next slide. So I'm just showing here the coefficient, the difference in difference coefficient. So this is the coefficient that tells you the impact of ACA Medicaid expansion on off-farm work. I apologize for not having the coefficients. I wasn't able to get the results approved in time. But the coefficients are really small, like less than 1%. So that's something that's really important to keep in mind. So let's first look at all beginning, that first column. So for both of these variables, so if anybody in the household works majority off farm, or if anybody in the household works at least 100 days off farm, we see that ACA Medicaid expansion leads to a decrease in off-farm work for all beginning operators. So this is what we would expect. Farmers don't have to work as much off-farm when they have an opportunity to have health insurance that's not tied to off-farm work. So it's statistically significant, but given the very small coefficients, it might not be as economically relevant. For any beginning, so this is those multi-generational operations, we see mixed results. And for established, we actually see an increase. Next slide. So the second way that we can look, or that we can assume that people make decisions, is basically household decisions regarding health insurance are made at the household level. So 2 or more members work off farm, and the decision on off-farm work is really an average in the household. So we have the proportion or the average number of operators working majority off farm, average days worked off farm, and then the average number or proportion of operators working at least 100 days off farm. So in looking at the results for this set of dependent variables, next slide, we see slightly different results. So the only significant result we see is for all beginning operations, where ACA Medicaid expansion leads to a decrease in the average days worked off farm. And these are similarly very small coefficients. So we do see a small impact of ACA Medicaid expansion on the decreasing off-farm work for all beginning operations. Next slide. So what we find is ACA Medicaid expansion had a small but statistically significant impact on reducing off-farm work for all beginning operations. For established operations, it increased off-farm work, and it had a mixed effect for multi-generational operations. But because we have the entire population of farms and not just the subset that were eligible for Medicaid expansion, it's possible that we'd see a larger effect if we were able to just analyze the eligible population. But I think overall, what we find is that if we do want to enable farmers, especially beginning farmers, to spend more time working on farm, health insurance is one mechanism by which we can enable them to spend more time working on farm.
Thank you for that presentation, Allie. And we will keep moving along. And our next presenter is Florence Biko.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I don't know if folks can see me or hear me. But today what I'll be talking about is diving more deeply into the interaction between the needs of the farm household and those of the farm business, and I will be doing that through the example of childcare. So I am Florence Biko from the National Farm Medicine Center, and I have been working on this paper with my colleague Shoshana Inwood at The Ohio State University. So when we look at we've been talking a lot about the centrality of family farms to agriculture today, and indeed when we look at data, family farms make up 98% of all farms, and they provide 88% of the production. But at the same time, and similarly to what both Shoshana and Alanina talked about, we have concerns about what the aging and the shrinking of the farm population are going to mean for the future of agriculture, around who will farm in the future, under what conditions, and how we can best support family farms. So the way that we are currently supporting the farm sector has largely been through a focus on the farm business, and we have programs such as the Beginning Farmer Rancher Development Program out of the USDA to support access to land, capital, and resources. And we also have a range of programs through the Farm Bill, such as, for example, crop insurance, to help stabilize income. But yeah, as much as families are quintessential to family farm, we haven't talked as much about the needs of the families and how those may intersect with the farm business. But in the research that we have done, looking at farm family social and economic needs, we find that when we look at health insurance, 1 in 2 farm families is worried about their ability to pay for major health crises without going into debt. And in the research that we have done on childcare pre-COVID-19, we were seeing that over 2/3 of farm families were reporting childcare challenges. So we've talked a lot about it today already, but in terms of why I care about the social and economic needs, to do this work, we turn a lot to the farm persistence literature, which is the body of work that also Annalena pointed to. And this body of research looks at why, how, and which farm families are able to stay on the land amidst ongoing changes. And key to our understanding of farm persistence is that deep interconnection and interreliance between individual, family, and the operation. Essentially, what we have is the constant exchange of resources such as money, time, and labor across the personal and professional spheres. And from this body of work, what we know is that as a result of that interconnection and exchange of resources, there are consequences and outcomes connected to safety and well-being, job quality, farm development and transition, economic viability, and adoption of new practices. Yet, as much as this body of literature has pointed to how essential family farms are, as much as this body of literature has talked about the importance of farm household in supporting the farm business, we know a lot less about what happens when the challenges are happening within the household and how they interact with the farm, operation. And Doug earlier in his presentation really gave some insights around how these household level challenges appear to have consequences on the farm business outcomes. So then we look at, to dive deeper into the question of social and economic needs in agriculture, we use the example of childcare, and we're looking to understand how childcare influenced the farm business. From the body of literature that we have been able to find, there has been little research done on childcare. A lot of it has been coming from our shop, looking specifically at farm families, and I want to acknowledge colleagues as well, Dr. Lee and Amy Lehman, who have looked specifically at farm workers. But from that work, and also from the work that looks at parenting, changes in parenting practices for farm families, what we see is the competing tensions at crucial points in the life course and farm business cycle. And it seems to be coming particularly to a head as there are changes in our social practices around how present we are in the raising of children and the importance of spending time with the children doing their activities. From this body of work, what we see is that children impact farm productivity and farm employment, and how the childcare supply and family goals influence the farm business decisions with potential long-term consequences. From that research that is qualitative or that is quantitative but exploratory and small sample, what we do seem to find too is variations based on gender of parents, the age and number of the children, farming background, of farm employment, and farm structure. And so really the goal of our project was to look more broadly and say what happens when we look at a large sample of farm families, what happens in terms of the prevalence, to what extent does childcare influence farm household and farm business strategies, as well as how do these strategies vary based on childcare arrangements, farm household, and farm business characteristics. And for the purpose of this project, we're looking at childcare as the supervision of the children of the active farm work site, and that can be paid or unpaid childcare. So for this project, we conducted a farm household survey that is part of a 5-year CDC-funded project that looks at farm families' lived realities with childcare and the role of childcare in farm children safety and farm business strategies. For the purpose of today's presentation, I will now go into the details of how childcare intersects with farm children safety, but what we've seen both through the quantitative data and the qualitative data from the past years is that we see a lot of interconnections between childcare decisions, farm children safety, as well as farm business strategies. So in terms of where our data are from, we collected them in the winter of 2023. A primary selection criteria was that folks were primary caregiver of children 0 to 18 and that they operated or managed a farm. We received responses from 47 states, and we have an analytical sample of 729 respondents. So to our knowledge, this is the largest survey on the topic that has been conducted in the US. As far as our analysis, we conducted bivariate and logistic regression analysis. The variables that we look at specifically in our models are both based on the previous studies, as well as the qualitative phase from this project. Looking at who our respondents are, 59% are beginning farmers. And when we look at how that compares with the general population, it's a much larger proportion of beginning farmers. I think in the general population, we have about 20% of beginning farmers. 67% of our respondents are from multi-generational farms, and 44% had sales over $250,000. The farm sale is important as well in the sense that we have a much larger representation of farmers who we might say are commercially oriented. So in other words, we have much more medium and large-scale farm operations compared to the general farm population. The other thing that I will mention is in terms of our respondents, about 80% of our respondents were women. And I will point at one point in the finding, I will point to where we might be seeing that playing out. So in terms of childcare arrangements, what we see is a kind of childcare bricolage that really reflect what we've seen in the quality phase in previous studies. In terms of farm parents are using a range of different childcare options that vary across the year and based on the age of the children. In our sample, they were using on average 2.7 different options besides parental care. Very important is family and friends, as well as school, as a form of having the children taken care of. But we also saw that childcare providers provide 43% of the care. This is an important finding in the sense that it is not uncommon to talk about farm families in terms of the romanticized idea of folks wanting to raise the children on the farm on their own. And here we do see that they are using childcare. When we look at the cost of childcare, half of our sample did not have expenses. And out of those who had expenses, over 70% were spending more than $100 per week. Then we asked about challenges experienced. We asked about two kinds of challenges. We asked about challenges connected to childcare supply, that is cost, availability, quality, and distance, and 3/4 of our respondents reporting challenges. This is an increase compared to the previous studies where we had 2/3 of folks reporting challenges, and it might have to do with COVID, with the impact of COVID on the childcare supply. We also looked at what about the availability of family and friends to watch the children. And over half reported that at some point they experienced challenges with accessing support family and friends. And this is another important point, in particular, since such a large proportion of our sample is from multi-generational farms, in the sense that same thing, we often think of farm families of having the kind of help that they need with a village to help raise the children. And what we heard is that it wasn't often the case. Some of it had to do with family and friends experiencing health challenges. Some of it had to do with folks being too busy with their own work. And some of it too had to do with folks not really wanting family and friends to be involved in the raising of the children. So let's look at how childcare intersects with the farm business. The first thing that we asked was, how does childcare impact the ability to get the farm work done? And we see that over 70% of all the respondents, it's either always, often, or sometimes that the children are impacting the ability to get the work done. And we see that the proportion of people who say always or often increases for folks who are currently experiencing challenges. We then asked about the kind of changes that people have made to adjust since the arrival of the children. And the idea was, what changes have you made in order to navigate the children, or work on the farm, enough farm work? We see that 70% of the respondents didn't make changes. And on average, they made over two changes out of the 9 options we had listed for them. We see that half of the respondents decreased their resources allocated to the farm business, and that included cutting down on the hours worked on the farm, scaling back farm production, as well as farm employee helping with childcare and doing less farm work. We also saw, and that connects back to the presentation that Ali just did, that folks a little under half decreased or stopped their off-farm work. And this has potential important implications, both in terms of household income, as well as access to health insurance, as we'll see in a minute. And then the third most frequent strategy was that folks hired labor for household or for farm work, over a third. We also asked about how childcare expenses limit farm investment. For all of the respondents, 29% said that yes, it does. And we saw that increases to a third of respondents when we look at folks who are experiencing childcare challenges. We were curious to see what would happen if childcare expenses were lower. And so we asked for folks who had childcare expenses, we asked them, how would you spend your resources if childcare wasn't as expensive? And here, this is where the gender piece may come up in terms of who our respondents were. And I haven't looked at the differences yet between men and women. But essentially, we see that some of the priorities among our respondents would be to spend more for the needs of the household, both in present time as well as in the future, such as savings for retirements. And this is where gender may come into play, because what we know from previous research is that women tend to still be the primary caregiver of the children as well as the household. The other piece that I want to point to, and as it pertains to larger discussions around farmer well-being and mental health, there has been more attention to the health and well-being of farm families in recent years. Some of the things that have been talked about is the importance for farm families to take time away from the farm, to have some time for leisure. And we do see this come out through our data where people would find or spend more on fun activities for the families if childcare expenses were lower. So let's look now at our second research question, which was to look at what are the variations in farm business decisions based on childcare arrangements, farm individual and household characteristics, and farm operation characteristics. So don't worry, I'm not going to go through all of this table, but I will talk you through the main aspects of it. So the way to read this table is that in the columns, we have the different business decisions that people have made, and this is based on yes or no. And then when you look down the column, these are the factors that came up as statistically significant in our analysis. The plus or minus in front of each factor is essentially saying whether this factor was associated with an increased or decreased probability of making that particular farm business decision. So there are a few big findings out of this table. First of all, is that the factors that seem to that are associated with making this particular decisions change from one decision to another. In other words, people are making different types of calculus for different decisions. At the same time, when we dive into the details of what those factors are, we see a couple of things. We see that the needs of children, in particular of youngest children, as well as having children with special needs, those are associated with making particular farm business decisions. We also see that access to resources seem to matter as well. And we see that both looking at childcare arrangements, whether or not people have adequate access to childcare, the kinds of childcare that is available to them, and also when we see in terms of the household income, the share of income from farming, as well as for the reduced farm work, pointing to the findings from Ali, a connection is how having health insurance through a farm work was negatively associated with reducing a farm work. But equally important, besides looking at the factors that are statistically significant, is also looking at the factors that were not associated with making a particular farm business decision. And for us, there's a couple of takeaway points from this one, is that the source of childcare, besides having childcare from family and friends, was not statistically significant in terms of shaping particular decisions, but the cost of that childcare did come up for one of the models. And also, we found limited variations for much of the farm demographic characteristics, including gender, race and ethnicity, educational attainment, and rurality of residents. The last thing that I wanted to do is show you in farmers' words, illustrates some of our findings through farmers' words. And through the survey, folks had the option to free type some comments. And so I will read you just four of those quotes. The first one really speaks to the interaction between the farm business, as well as changes based on the age of the children. This person said, for example, from our council, being the parent of school-age kids is much easier than preschool, infant, toddler-age kids. It was massively difficult to navigate work, farm life, and childcare when our kids were 0 to 5. We almost went bankrupt and our mental health suffered. It's much easier now than school and childcare is free. Then the respondent from Oregon also points to the importance or to the role played by off-farm work as well as childcare supply when they wrote that their wife was a teacher for 10 years. When we had our third child, our daycare shut down and we scrambled. After a lot of discussions, we decided she needed to stay home with the kids. It's been very hard to cover the added expense of health insurance on only one income. This family respondent from Ohio pointed to the importance of the childcare supply when they wrote, lack of childcare has been the primary impediment to growing my farm business. And then the respondent from New York too speaks more broadly of other supports for the family, which came up during the panel this morning when they talk about there are no programs that I'm aware of to help self-employed people afford time off after a child is born or due to complications with birth. This is problematic. So bringing everything together and also reflecting back on the previous findings, we find that in line with the previous studies that there is a high proportion of respondents that are experiencing childcare challenges and that are making changes to balance farm children, farm work, and off-farm work responsibilities. We also see the intersections of farm household and farm operation playing out, and that's why I added back the figure from an earlier slide, where the needs of the children are going to shape childcare decisions and farm business decisions, as well as the importance of access to resources. And that connects back to another project that we did with Shoshana on health insurance, where we found that what matters most in terms of people experiencing medical economic vulnerability was specifically access to resources. And so for us, this brings up exciting research questions that I sure hope I'm working on in the short term, which are what are the long-term consequences of experiencing childcare challenges on the farm business, development, farm viability, and farm families' well-being. To be able to do that, we need longitudinal data. And the example from Doug's presentation earlier today with 2 waves of the Ohio Farm Poll points to the importance of this access to this kind of data. And then the other question is, if childcare support increases, what is the impact on the farm household and the farm business? And this takes me back to some studies that are based on experiments that have been done in the Democratic Republic of Congo, very different country from the US. But what some folks at the World Bank did is they did an experiment where in a very rural village in the Congo, they started offering childcare. And what they saw for those farm families is that they saw big increases in farm productivity, better quality of life, as well as diversification on the farm business. So in terms of the broad implications, really what this research does is it adds on to the existing body of work that we have on social and economic needs among the farm families and the challenges experiences those. So when we look at research, that means the importance of integrating social and economic needs as variables of social and economic sustainability. And that's also connected to the type of research that is prioritized by our funders and the importance of making sure that we can do this type of research, that there are access to resources. For extension and farm service providers, that means the importance of integrating social and economic needs as components of risk management and farm economics. And then for government agencies and policymakers, that means the importance of integrating these factors in agricultural and food policies, the collaborations across agencies and portfolios. And for my last slide, I wanted to leave you with kind of a movement forward, because I think this day is also about what do we do next. When we asked farm families who should represent their needs in national childcare policy discussions, over 70% said that the USDA and farm organizations should be involved in those discussions. What's really interesting too is that it tracks very closely when we ask the same question about health insurance and whether USDA should represent the needs of farmers. And similarly, it was over 70% of folks who had said yes. And this quote from the Wisconsin farmer is something that we have heard over and over again in the last 10 years of research on the topic, whereas healthcare and childcare for farm ranch families should be a national priority if we want to keep farming as a professional industry in our country. So I'll leave you with that. I have some acknowledgements for farm families who have participated in the study, as well as Sarah Wiskowski, Catherine Morrissey, and Scottia Detweiler, who helped with some of the data cleanup as well as data collection. Also acknowledging the funding, both from CDC as well as internal funding on the institution. Thank you.
Thank you, Florence, and thanks to all 3 of our presenters for 3 very interesting and related topics as related to the farm household. Feel free to put questions in the chat. I see that there's a couple. I will start off though for our 3 presenters. So my first question would be, so I am the branch chief of the Rural Economy Branch. So I tend to think a lot in rural terms, and this is a conference on the farm household. So what are some similarities of issues that farm households encounter with respect to viability, health care, and childcare needs? What are the similarities between them and between non-farm but rural households? And then a related question would be, what are some features that are distinct or unique to farm households. So let's start with Annalena, and then we can go to Allie and Florence.
Thank you. Speaking of childcare, I have some background noise, so maybe come back to me.
Oh, okay. Well, let's move on to Allie.
So I didn't analyze the difference between rural and not, but I think that would be an interesting component that I could add to see the differences. And then can you repeat so beyond rural?
Oh, just like, what do you think would be unique to farm households with respect to having access to healthcare as opposed to just general rural households?
So this was not part of my research, but I would think it's much harder. Like, I work from home and my children can make noise behind me and it's okay. And I think that is much harder to accomplish on a farm while being safe. So I just think it's harder to multitask the two when you have a farm business compared to, but that holds true for a lot of people that go to work like at a service job too. So it's not maybe directly related to farming. I'll pass it to Florence. She probably has better intel on this question.
Jessica, this is a tricky question.
I did not mean to stump you.
In all seriousness, to Allie's point, when it comes to safety of the children in agriculture, I didn't get into it today, but childcare plays a very big role to essentially make sure that the children are not in the dangerous farm work site. And of course, we know that it's not always an option. I think that you do bring up an important questions that when it comes to social and economic needs, those are not specific to just farmers. Those are needs that we all have throughout our life course at one point or another, or we'll have versions of, right? What we do know is that farmers are most often embedded in rural areas, not all of them. And we also know that rural areas experience, have more dearth of services, right? We know that healthcare access in rural areas is a lot more complicated, both for primary care, dental, as well as specialty care. And I don't know if I have the number specifically in mind, but I think it's 60% of rural counties experience shortages of some sort in terms of healthcare providers. And then when it comes to childcare, there was a study that predates COVID, but I think it was 3 in 5 communities were defined as childcare landscapes. And so in terms of what your physical and social environment look like in rural areas, there is just less of it to go around than if you live in a suburban or rural or an urban area. To the specificities of farmers, what we've seen is in terms of childcare. And I don't think it's different from, and there are similarities with other business owners, right? And people who do not choose their work hours is that when you work on a farm, and it depends on the seasonality as well, right? Your needs, your schedule is flexible, and it might not be the same from one week to another, from one season to another. And what we've seen is that it can cause a problem, not only because the expectation is now that the children will be in childcare for the entire time that you're working, because otherwise you might have children who are in childcare for 60 hours. And that brings up questions about the well-being of the children, but also in terms of childcare access, both for family-based as well as for center-based, is there might not be a spot for you if you don't want to keep it the whole time. So I stop there.
Thank you. Very, very great points that are made. I'm gonna move on. I think, there's been a few questions in the chat. Keep them coming. Well, what types of studies in the realm of each of your topics, so farm viability, healthcare, childcare, what types of studies do you think are needed, and what types of data is needed to effectively communicate these issues to policymakers? Annalena, I don't know if you can speak to this now, but if you can, I'd like to hear from you first.
Yeah, thanks. I can jump in. Yeah, I think that bringing in a livelihood perspective will be really helpful for us to better understand some of these interrelationships that we've been talking about between how farmers are meeting their social and economic needs and maintaining their business. And I think that, having better data to be able to take more of a livelihoods approach will be really valuable. So based on the study that we've done, an example of something that I'd like to see, just better data, and that can really, a couple things. So one, I think, is more disaggregated and nuanced data on farmers' revenue streams. So what are all the different input revenue strategies and sources of income that they're relying on to actually support their farm business, and doing a better job of disaggregating that. And I forgot what the other point I was going to make was, so I'll jump in if I remember it.
Thanks, Annalena. Allie.
So I use almost exclusively USDA data sources, such as the census and ARMS and local food marketing practices survey. So I feel very grateful to get to use these data. And I know from those of you that collect your own data how incredibly hard it is and expensive. So I'm so grateful the USDA collects all this data. And I think the census is this incredible source of data, and it's probably just, it's not about the farm household. And I could be wrong, but I can't imagine it would change. ARMS, I think, is a survey that is, as Mary spoke about earlier, is really about both the farm household and the farm business. And it does change every year based on researchers at ERS advocating for certain questions. So so the local food questions have been advocated yearly, and they've been on there with a drop off here and there. And there's been a special issue, or there was a special, I think 2014 special questions regarding health insurance. And there is some health insurance questions, they change a bit, but they are asked in ARMS. We tried this year with the help of Florence and Shoshana to get childcare questions added to ARMS, but we were not successful. So I think if there could be, I think ARMS is really the place nationally that where they collect data on the farm household. So if there could be something there that's like childcare, healthcare, like just something that could be consistently on ARMS about these issues, I think it would be really helpful. And then I think Florence talked about this a bit, but if like in the recent AFRI call, if you look at it, there's nothing about the farm household. So you're not going to get an AFRI most likely funded if it's not part of what is prioritized. So I think if there's any way at the higher levels to get farm household well-being at the level at which it's a priority so that it can be funded through like AFRI and some of these other big grant programs, then we could have more research on the topic.
Great. Thanks, Allie. And I know what you're saying about the lack of questions on ARMS on childcare. And we have a small group that are once again going to advocate for that questions. And I'm sure they're probably, if they're not already, will be in touch with you all to, try to think of the best question going forward that meets all everybody's research needs. Florence, I want to give you a chance to respond to this question.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. It's something, data access is something that we spend a lot of time thinking about, talking about in reference to ARMS. It's not only the childcare questions, but it's also the elder care question and caregiving along the life course. And I'm going to put a very quick plug for another survey that we're doing with Shoshana on caregiving along the life course with the North Central Regional Development Center out of Purdue University. It's not specifically focused on farmers, but it is really diving into these questions and having access to data. What I can say is that we have been fortunate to have access to funding through USDA and through CDC to do primary data collection. And what we've seen with this work is the incredible responses from people to participate in this research. And I think Shoshana talked about it a little bit in our introduction remark, is the extent to which people are ready to talk about their social and economic needs and want to talk about it. And as a result of doing that data collection, we have been invited numerous places to present our findings. We have research groups, and we're really using these primary data that are collected to really point to the importance of talking about these issues. The last thing I say about the RFAs for USDA funding and other sources of funding, there actually was a time when in the AFRI, which is a very important source of funding for us to do research on this on farm families, there was a point in time where health insurance, family well-being were specifically called out. But then when there was a change in administration, that went away. And it really highlights too how the research that we do can be political. And as administrations change, the priorities and what different administrations want to be emphasized. And that's a problem, right? Because that means that we lose a lot of time and access to funding when those are questions, those are issues that have been going on for decades. There are, evidence of childcare and health insurance challenges going back to the 1980s.
Well, I'm going to go over to the chat now. We do have a few questions that some of our audience have written in. The first one, and this goes to all three panelists. What do you think are the top 2 to 3 priorities and sustainable solutions to these challenges that have been presented today? Great question. Let's start with Annalena on this one.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd like to actually shift, responding to that question. I see the issue of concentration and consolidation in the food system as really being a fundamental issue that we haven't talked about as much in this panel or conference so far, but I really see as an underlying root issue that is eroding farmers' ability to actually earn a living and earn sufficient income from agriculture. And then I think closely related to that, in terms of sustainable solutions that I think we are talking about in the conference, that's maybe a connective thread across sessions, is what kinds of approaches and measures we're actually relying on, and what data are we collecting, and how are we evaluating the economic performance of agriculture. Because if we want to develop more, policies to address some of the issues that we're talking about, if we don't have measures that actually do assess sustainability related outcomes, then it's going to be very difficult for us to see those kinds of policy changes that we need to address the issues that we're talking about. So I think a really related both current issue and then way of addressing that is just what we're talking about in many of these sessions, is actually integrating more sustainability indicators, which there is a very strong scholarship that is existing that doesn't seem to be shaping the design of policy and data collection and the metrics we're using currently, and integrating those in so that we can actually have data that speak to making the kinds of policy changes that we need to see.
Thanks, Annalena. Allie, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so this is coming from the perspective of I'm a research scientist. So this is definitely coming from my perspective and related to what I said, but my previous comment, but I think we need to have national data sources that are available to everybody, like ARMS, that asks these questions every year. And I think it needs to be a funding priority. So, even when we help organize this conference, it's a very small group of researchers. When you do your literature review, it's pretty much, it's a small group of people to cite that are working on these issues. And I think it's largely because it's not a priority that receives much funding. So I would think publicly available data, mostly through ARMS, and then priority in terms of funding projects looking at the household, the farm household.
Great. And Florence.
Yes, and I know who exactly that question is from. It's my colleague Brian, who has the talent for asking those tricky questions. As I was talking to him yesterday about childcare, I think to Ananina's point, right, when we look at challenges around being a profitable farm owner operator, right, and it's looking at those larger economic structures and how they are shaping the structure of agriculture as well as what farm income looks like. And I want to point out to some of the fantastic work that other colleagues have been doing, such as Mary Andricks and Phil Howard, that really have looked at concentration and consolidation agriculture, among other people. I know I'm forgetting other people. I think that we're at a point where we have documented these challenges. I think that where we really need to look at is what are the solutions that work. And to David's question in the chat, is what are other countries looking? What do other models look like? I would tell you though that as Ali was saying, there is for some reason a very limited amount of research, but we do know from looking at OECD data, World Bank data, that there are key differences across countries in terms of what social and economic outcomes look like, health outcomes look like. And we know that those are connected to what social policies look like, to the types of social supports that are available to folks. And as some folks talked about this morning, there are really stark differences between the US as a high-income country against other high-income countries that have very different types of policies. And I'll just give you one quick example that comes from France, since that's where I'm very familiar. But in agriculture, there is access to paid parental leave as well as childcare support, because the idea is that it's hard to get your work done when you are in the later stages of your pregnancies, when you have a young child, and it's hard to get your work done when the children are around, and hence access to childcare solutions with some tweaks to respond to the specific needs of the farm sector.
Thanks, Florence. And I can put in my 2 cents from the networking session. We had a small group of us that were in the session that I was in, and it was we had some members from Rural Development Community Facilities Program, and we also had some people there that had either recently received a grant from them for a childcare facility, or were looking into, you know, what they could do to get childcare. And I think it was definitely mentioned amongst, you know, those that are looking or recent recipients of have more money, have more of those grants, especially because loans can be difficult with childcare because, and I wrote this down. It doesn't necessarily make money, is what one member said. And so, you know, when you're getting a loan and you have to show that you can pay that loan back, that can be difficult. So having more grants, because we definitely have childcare deserts in rural areas. So that there's a need for that, and having more grant money is always good to help out these rural areas getting things started. And I just had one last question, and I don't know if all of you can speak to this, so I'll just throw it out to any of you. But what do you think could be done to attract professionals? So either childcare, people who work in childcare, right, that are licensed, healthcare professionals, you know, what could attract them to rural places? Because, you know, the need for it, to have health care insurance, and then, you know, to need childcare, but then you need to also have people provide those services to you as well. If any thoughts on being able to attract people that can provide those services to rural places. And I'm just going to throw it out to any of you.
I mean, Jessica, I think it makes me think to some of the work that you've done, right, on rural community development and the importance of social and physical infrastructures. I think that Adam also talked about it quite a bit this morning about if we want people in rural areas, we have to have access to adequate resources. When it comes to attracting and retaining childcare and healthcare workers, I think it's the importance of a income that will support people in those jobs. In particular, in childcare, we don't talk a whole lot about the childcare supply, right? But it's a sector where people are making very little money, oftentimes with no benefits. And so that's the tricky part too, is on one hand, you have parents who, financially might not be able to offer too much childcare. And then the people who provide that childcare, are not making enough money. And to the last point that I want to make is the extent to which those needs are connected. And one example is my research institute is actually embedded in a rural healthcare system. And that research on childcare that we've been doing with Shoshana, specifically on the farm sector, has been echoing a lot with other parts of my healthcare system, because one of the key challenges that they are experiencing to attract and retain healthcare workers to come work for our system is access to childcare. And we're talking about folks that, from a financial perspective, those folks are doctors. The cost might not be the bigger problem, but it's the lack of childcare that just makes it that people are not going to come, because you cannot be a surgeon and have your children in the operating room with you.
Now that's a great point. It's all interrelated, and being able to attract healthcare professionals, you need these other services in place that they're going to need, right? So I just want to once again thank the three researchers that we had today on this session. It was a great session, and I will hand it back over to Martha to guide us to the next place.
Thank you.
Sure. So thank you, Jessica. Thanks everyone in the session for this great conversation. We are going to take a 5-minute break before moving into our final session of the day. So again, you'll have to go back to that event hub, and then you can open up session 3. It will not start until 5 minutes past the hour, so it might scroll there a little bit. You'll see a little countdown clock, but at 5 past, that is when we will start session 3, Overcoming Barriers to Meeting Farm Household and Farm Business Goals. We'll see you then.